Get started. Welcome to Developing Fair, Consistent, and Transparent Grading Practices. Professors' grading policies reflect their own beliefs about student learning, motivation, and success. Grading policies often vary across campus, within individual departments, and even between instructors in the same department teaching the same course. Faculty might believe that their grading practices are fair, but oftentimes policies inadvertently perpetuate achievement disparities. So grades might be more indicative of how an individual instructor grades than a valid assessment of student learning, but there are some more serious considerations to grading regarding equity. Traditional grading approaches often advantage privileged students while disadvantaging historically underserved students, which can interfere with retention and success efforts. So in this workshop, we're going to explore some research-based grading practices that promote equity and examine why certain policies may contribute to achievement gaps. I am Amanda Smothers. I'm the Teaching and Learning Coordinator and temporarily an online learning co-coordinator for the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning at NIU. And in the chat, I'll have you introduce yourselves to everyone. I know what departments you all are from because I have the registration list, but introducing yourselves to each other. What's your department division? What's your role? Are you an instructor, a professor, or a TA? And what do you hope to get out of this workshop? So again, text chat, what's your department division, your role, and what do you hope to get out of this workshop? Great, thank you, Steve. Excellent, thank you, thank you. So thanks all for introducing yourselves and explaining what you hope to get out of it. Is making sure that our grading is fair and equitable, and seeing if we need to maybe make any changes or adjustments to that. Great. So one thing that I like to do is a little emoji check-in. So there's a little emoji icon next to the bold, italics, underline, text editing, say something. So just pick an emoticon or an emoji that kind of is how you're feeling today. This is something good to do with students too, just so you can gauge how everyone is doing. See if there's, might help, one's being a little quieter than normal, or more talkative than normal. That might help to explain things a little bit, can get the lay of the land a little bit. So whenever you find your emoji, post it there. And you keep doing that as I go through the workshop goals. So our workshop goals for today are discussing some issues related to fairness, consistency, and transparency in grading with an eye toward equity in grading. So what we want to look at is aligning grading with your teaching philosophy, and articulating your teaching philosophy is the first step in that process. So grading equitably, how can we create an equitable grading system, and how can we determine whether our current grading system is equitable? Policies for late assignments as well. What are some of the equity issues involved in late work policies, and what are some examples of equitable late work policies? Effective communication. Having a grading process and policies that are created with equity in mind is great, but students need to be aware of those policies for them to be truly fair, consistent, and especially transparent. Grading rubrics is another topic that we're going to talk about. They're one grading tool that could help you develop fair grading practices by standardizing your grading and helping you focus on established criteria and levels of performance when grading student work or performance. And then finally, providing feedback. Providing timely feedback is essential to establishing equitable grading practices, and that feedback throughout the learning process is essential for student learning. So toward making our grading system more equitable is by aligning grading with your teaching philosophy. And you might need to articulate your teaching philosophy before you can articulate your grading philosophy. There are a lot of online tools that can help you find your teaching philosophy. We won't cover those here. I can send you some links in my follow-up email though. But I do encourage you to seek out those tools, particularly if you've never developed or articulated your teaching philosophy, or if it's been a long time since you've revisited it. Questions that you'll want to consider when you're aligning your grading system with your teaching philosophy might be, what are the most important things that you want your course grading system to accomplish for you as the learning facilitator? What are the most important things you want your course grading system to accomplish for your students? What do your grades represent? So for example, do your grades represent student mastery of established learning objectives? Or do they represent students' performance relative to their peers? Which do you think might be fairer and more consistent? Do you believe only a certain number of students should be able to achieve an A in your course? Or do you believe in commending students' demonstration of learning by conferring a commensurate grade? Current grading policies be contributing to equity gaps? So that's something that we definitely want to consider. We examine our grading practices. Also, do you believe that student work should be assessed based on a specific set of criteria, which is criterion grading? Or do you believe that student work should be assessed in terms of how it measures up against the work of other students? That's normative grading. And think about how criterion grading might be more equitable than normative grading. And finally, do you believe in assessing grade penalties for late work and other infractions? Why or why not? And how might that affect equity in your grading practices? In an article by Katrina Schwartz, How Teachers Are Changing Practices with an Eye on Equity, she quotes a physics teacher, Nick Sigman, who points out that students are very much aware that school is a game and that your grades aren't based on how well you understand something, but on how well you play that game. On to say that it's easy to get defensive about your grading policy because as a teacher, you want to believe that you're doing the right thing and that your grades are meaningful and that you've figured out a system of grading that makes sense. And he talks about his change in perspective on grading. And he describes his new thoughts about grading saying, I have to be more thoughtful. My grades are now meant to be an accurate reflection of a student's mastery of the standards set by the state in high school physics. He's a high school physics teacher. So if a student can display their knowledge of those standards without doing the homework, according to Sigman, he shouldn't be penalized for that in his grade, especially because students all have different responsibilities outside of school that can make getting homework done difficult. So that's one perspective. So in that same article, there are some tips for grading for equity as well as other resources. So one of them is to grade by standard or objective rather than by assignment. So that involves assessing whether students are mastering standards or course objectives rather than receiving points simply for completing assignments. Another strategy that they mention is ditching homework and extra credit grades, and that goes along with that previous strategy, which is that students are graded based on their progress towards those established objectives rather than encouraging, points grabs for smaller homework assignments and extra credit. And by moving away from that points type of grading, the goal would be that students would see the only way to improve their grade is by mastering those standards or those objectives. Another strategy that I mentioned is ensuring that grades reflect what students know, not whether they're just compliant. So in other words, emphasizing mastery rather than behavior management in your grading practices. Should students be getting a grade based on how compliant they are, or should they be assessed based on their mastery of course objectives? And which do you think is fair? That might be a situational thing based on the course. And then finally, think about whether your grading practices inadvertently punish students with fewer resources. So for example, a student who comes into your classroom with less content knowledge or preparation for schooling need to make effort and revise an assignment more times or take an exam more times to master that course content than someone coming into your course with more resources and preparation from prior educational experiences. So should that former student who ends the course having mastered the content be punished by always having a lower grade than the latter student who also ends the course having mastered the content, but who began the course by better grades because they had more resources coming in? So just thinking about whether averaging grades over the semester is an equitable practice in light of that scenario. And finally, going back to that quotation on the previous slide, consider what your goals are for grading and student learning. Should students' grades be based on how well they know something or how well they can play that proverbial game? More tips. Consider whether you should be grading student participation. Now, there's a back and forth on that. What are you looking for? What to assess whether students are quote unquote participating? Looking for eye contacts, note taking, speaking up in class, not having side conversations while you're lecturing or giving instructions. And how might some of those elements of so-called participation reveal inequity? So for example, if eye contact is a criteria for participation, how are students who feel uncomfortable with or are unable to make eye contact, whether for cultural reasons or because they're autistic or because they have a visual impairment or blindness or for some other reason, affected by this policy that they cannot adhere to? So might that be unfair to those students or inequitable? How might your unintentional bias toward the learning style that you prefer be affecting your students' grades in that way? Another strategy is to require retakes if a student earns below a certain grade. And that encourages students to continue the learning process rather than just earning a poor grade and moving on. If one of our goals in teaching is to facilitate student learning, then we need to think outside of the box for ways to do that. And this is one possible strategy. Students who earn a grade that indicates mastery and demonstrates their learning goals are met would not have to retake the exam. But students who fall below mastery or do not demonstrate that learning goals have been met would need to take another look at the course material, continue that learning process, and retake the assessment to determine whether they have progressed. That new grade would then replace the old grade, not be averaged with it, because that more recent grade represents the student's mastery and learning progress. And group work issues. Provide individual assessment for group work, not a group grade. Collaboration is important, so group work shouldn't be avoided. That's not what the suggestion is, but a grade doesn't necessarily indicate whether an individual student mastered the standards. That's why, to be fair and equitable and have students' grades reflect their own learning, individual grades should be assigned for group work. And that helps with the common problem, too, of one or two students doing all the work and the rest of the students earning the same grade. And then anonymous grading is the last one here. So think about whether, while you're grading assignments, do you let any unconscious attitudes or biases about individual students affect how you grade them, whether positively or negatively. And you can implement anonymous grading if you're grading through interactive rubric on Blackboard, for example. That is one option to help a little bit more equitably. Next thing I want to talk about is policies for late assignments. One grading policy that you want to consider through an equity-minded lens is your late work policy. And some questions that you might want to consider are, what do your grades represent? Is it how well students are learning, or again, that compliance with the rules? Another question, what assumptions do you make when students don't turn in work? And then what is the reality? How can you find out? What might be some obstacles that students are facing? So for example, there might be anxiety issues. I know we've got a lot more mental illness now in light of the pandemic. Executive functioning skill gaps, lack of necessary resources. Can they afford the textbook, for example? Or external professional or personal obligations? And how should we address equity issues like those while not penalizing students because we assume that they're just unmotivated? Another thing to consider is whether we're grading too many things. Can We switched to just grading summative assessments and providing feedback on formative assessments, but not grade credit for those smaller assignments. And then how to encourage students to do ungraded formative work and see the value in it. That's one of our challenges. Another question, what kind of grading system is realistic for you? What's a grading plan that's manageable so that you're not behind on your grading? If you are behind on your grading, how are students expected to see the value in turning in their own work on time? And then finally, is letting students turn in piles of late work just to get the points pointless? Switch to just providing feedback on formative assessments and don't enter them into a grade book. Will they be more meaningful for learning? Options for equitable late work policies. There's a lot of different strategies. I'll just point out a few of the most common. But some options that you might want to consider for equity in your late policy include extension requests. How can students request an extension? Could you, for example, implement an online form to standardize that process? Do students have to prove that they need an extension? And what equity issues might that proof introduce into your grading practices? Students instead be required to reflect on why they needed an extension so that they can determine whether it's in their power to solve problems that might be getting in the way of their success. Another option for equitable late work policy is late passes. So could students be given a certain number of late passes for assignments in a semester? So in other words, students can turn in a certain number of assignments late within a reasonable time frame in case life circumstances necessitate it. Another option would be floating deadlines. Also might have heard them called flexible due dates. And that involves providing a range of due dates for work. So for example, you would offer students incentives to turn in the work early, such as getting more thorough or early feedback on an assessment, or allowing resubmissions with revisions for early submissions. Another option would be work in progress. So that would involve allowing students to submit assignments that aren't yet completed. And that's one way to see how students are progressing. So for example, one way to do it is you could have students provide you with links to works in progress in their OneDrive or Google Drive, so you can check in on the work before it's due, provide some feedback that might help them succeed, and let them know when you're going to be checking in on it, so you can make sure that they've got something there to provide feedback on. And then another option would be optional or self-selected homework, and that involves not grading homework, but instead providing it as an opportunity for students to learn and progress toward course outcomes ahead of those graded assessments. This option would definitely involve some work on the faculty member's part to help students see the value in completing this work. And part of the value added is the faculty member providing substantive and meaningful feedback on students' optional or self-selected homework so that they get something out of it that will help them ahead of that graded assessment. Regardless of what your grading policies are, it is essential to communicate those policies to students clearly and effectively so they understand how their academic performance is going to translate to their course grade. Demystifying your grading system is an important step toward equity. And important elements of what you communicate to students should include first explaining the grading process. For example, how do assessments align with learning materials and activities? How do they align with the course objectives? How will students be involved in the grading process? Who's going to do the grading? And how will you ensure that the grading is consistent and fair? An element is explaining your grading policies. So what are your due date policies, your late work policies? What's your grading scale? Do you grade on a curve? Another element is explaining your grading criteria. So what elements students will be graded on, what levels of performance look like. So what does an A look like? What does a B look like, for example? Or what does exemplary work look like? What does proficient work look like? How are the criteria weighted in their overall grade as well? So what's weighted, are they all weighted equally? Or, is one thing more important than another, so it's weighted more heavily and they should focus on that. Then explain rubrics to them and what they mean and how to read them. Explain all of the grading tools. As a matter of fact, the rubric if there's a checklist, if there's a rating scale, if there's self-assessment. And then finally, just returning work in a timely manner. Have a policy for when you're going to return work and adhere to it. And communicate with your students if you need to veer away from that, if you need some extra time, and then give them a deadline and try to stick to that later deadline. So more on grading rubrics. What can rubrics do? Rubrics can help us to set anchor points along a quality continuum so that we can set a reasonable and appropriate expectation for students, and so that we can aim to consistently judge how well students have met those expectations. They divide an assignment into its component parts. They provide detailed descriptions of what constitutes different levels of performance for each of those parts or criterion, which shows how students, how they can succeed on the assessment, and that's how it should be presented to students. I'm definitely in favor of providing students with the grading rubric before they turn in an assignment. I think that students should be aware of how they're going to be graded before they're graded. So what can rubrics do for you and your students? They can function as an instructional and an evaluation tool. They can help you facilitate timely feedback. It involves, if you've got a good rubric that's very descriptive, it involves a lot of work on the front end to create the rubric. But once you get into grading, it facilitates faster grading because that feedback in there, you can tailor any additional comments to individual student assignments, and then you can point them to your descriptors if they have other questions about why they got certain scores. It can also help you refine your teaching by better organizing or defining your expectations for students. So if you're going to be assessing on certain criteria, then that will help you refine how you organize your lessons, your learning materials, your learning activities, so that you can focus on those objectives. It'll also help facilitate communication between you and your students. It will prepare and guide students' work if you give them access to that grading rubric ahead of time. And it'll help you assess student mastery of learning objectives and ensure that that's how you're assessing students based on those objectives. So ultimately, rubrics can promote fair, consistent, and transparent assessment and evaluation practices. Some considerations you'll want to address when creating or selecting a pre-existing rubric. Does the rubric align with your course outcomes or objectives? Especially if you're selecting a pre-existing rubric and tailoring it to your assignment. Does the rubric include performance levels, multiple performance levels? Does the rubric describe what students need to do to master the criteria? Do rubric criteria reflect current notions of mastery in your field? Are the rubric scores well defined? Is the rubric bias-free? Does the rubric allow for inter-rater reliability? So if someone else were to grade your students' assignments or their students' assignments, your rubric, and you graded them, would the inter-rater reliability, would you give them roughly the same grade or the same scores? And then also, is the rubric useful, practical, and manageable? Any questions at this point before we move on? All right, great. Well, if you think of anything, just post it to the chat. I don't have too much content left, but I do have some space for questions at the end as well, and some reflection before then on what you might want to implement. Providing feedback, and this kind of goes along with grading rubrics, but feedback is more than just feedback on an assessment. It is important to improving students' learning and performance. So to address equity issues and gaps in our courses, we need to try to provide students with equitable opportunities to learn and to progress toward mastery of learning outcomes. So an important way to do that is by providing substantive, so with substance, and constructive feedback. But not all feedback is equally helpful. So I do want to just point out some of the characteristics of effective feedback. And they're on the screen there. So it's prioritized, descriptive, and constructive, actionable, and timely. Prioritized. Choose what to provide feedback on. Sometimes the temptation is to provide feedback on everything and to mark up students' work, for example. But we want to resist the urge to provide too much feedback. It can be overwhelming to students. It can lead to feelings of hopelessness. So what are the few most important things the student should focus on for improvement? And prioritize your feedback to include the most pressing issues and how students can improve rather than pointing out every little detail. And also focus your feedback on the objectives that you want students to get out of that particular assessment. So anything that's outside of those objectives, you want to leave off of your feedback if it's not going to be addressed in the rubric in their grade. Providing good feedback or effective feedback is also descriptive and constructive. Be specific in your feedback on student work. So rather than vague platitudes, provide some specific areas a student excelled in using criteria language. And then similarly, when a student needs improvement in an area, provide specific details about the student's areas for improvement. So in other words, give the student evidence. Tell the student specifically what they did well on and what they need to improve on. Effective feedback is also actionable. Be specific in telling students what they need to do with your feedback. What should they do differently next time? So be specific there and make it clear what action students need to take to resolve issues in their work and close gaps in their mastery of standards. So it's not always enough just to tell students, this is correct. You need to tell them how to do it correctly. Get a learning experience so that they can improve. Then finally, effective feedback is timely, as I've mentioned. Give student feedback that comes in time for them to actually do something with it. If feedback doesn't come until 2 or 3 or 4 weeks after they've turned something in, it's lost its meaning and its usefulness. And chances are students will have perpetuated those same mistakes in the meantime on other work. So I just want to get your feedback now. What are your current grading practices? What are some changes you'd like to make with your grading practices or policies? And what do you think of some of the topics raised during this workshop? So again, all just suggestions, not things that you're being mandated to do or have to do even if you don't think that they'll work for your class. Let's think about some of these ideas and what we might want to change. So never thought about the accessibility of grading things like eye contact. Yeah, that's a good point. There are things that we might, grade and we just kind of don't think about it. And then wants to be more timely with grading, but struggling with students actually looking at the rubric and actually look at the feedback afterwards. I think that's a common problem. And so I think one of the things that I found works is going over the rubric with my students in class, showing them where to find it, going over what everything means and actually talking them through that. And then I've also had them use the rubric to grade their own drafts. so that they could identify maybe areas that they needed to improve before they turned it in for a grade. So that's another option, or having them grade each other during peer review, using the rubric too. And then actually looking at the feedback afterwards. There's different ways to do that. You can, tie a reflection to that, have them reflect on your feedback and turn that in, and make that, use like rules for accessing other assignments, materials in the course contingent upon them submitting that reflection, or, making that a component of their grade. And then what else do we have here? So late policy, like to revise that to have more flexibility. Great. Reinforcing the importance of keeping feedback focused and limited. Yeah, I like using that rubric to grade themselves, and to have them grade each other too. It gives them more familiarity with the rubric. And for the most part, I won't say like all the time, but for the most part, they're pretty spot on with how they grade themselves using the rubric, as long as I, teach them how to use it. You get the outlier every once in a while who's like, I did amazing. And you're like, did you read the rubric? But for the most part, pretty accurate with how they grade themselves. Great. Any other comments or suggestions or things that you might want to adjust, or things more information about that I can send to you afterwards? In regards to the flexibility of late policies, I've done some different things with my flexible work policies. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not work. It depends on the class, and so you might need to adjust it depending on, the individual class. One class that I had, I had flexible due dates, very flexible due dates in that class, and nobody took advantage, and they all did a great job, and most of them turned in all of the work on time. And then I tried it again in a different class, and it totally bombed, and everyone turned it in at the very last possible minute within that window. And, I just had a lot of problems with that individual class. So I think it's kind of making those adjustments too. If something's not working, maybe you might need to shift a bit and kind of gauge how that class is. And I've since gone to a more limited flexible due dates. So, I have a due date, and then they can turn it in, up to a couple of days after that. And, once it's closed, it's closed. And then I tell them they can always, ask me for an extension as well, which I might actually formalize with an online form to make that a little bit more accessible to students too, and make them more comfortable asking. Because I think too, when students, first generation students, college students, for example, might feel intimidated about asking for help. So, kind of adding that layer of, you don't have to come to me face to face. You can fill out this form, and this is a standard thing, and, everybody can use it, might help. All right, yeah. So giving the class the opportunity to negotiate a due date policy, I think that's a great idea. Giving them some ownership over the policies in the class. I've had my students develop rubrics as well. So I tell them to do, or I have done this in the past, I would tell them to do research on whatever. I teach writing mainly, so tell them to do research on, writing genres, conventions, and then back to class with that research. And then, we all as a class together, I help them craft a rubric based on their research, and then they understand why those things are on the rubric instead of just, here's what I'm assessing you on. Okay, so one of the due date policies that they negotiated was every student has one pass to use for submitting a late assignment within that week. Okay, great. Yeah, and I think that, takes into account individual classes makeup, and that those students' needs and circumstances. They can negotiate for, different policies that'll work for them in that class. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing where you're just, carrying things over from semester to semester. Great. Other thoughts or ideas, things that you've tried that worked well or didn't work so? A teacher thing and let there be silence for a minute. Thanks, Steve. I'm glad that it was helpful. All right, that was a minute of silence. Here's a list of resources, and I'll send these to you all who are here today live. I'll send these to you in a follow-up email. I will send you the link to today's recording as well. Thanks. So if you have any questions, you can stick around. Again, I'm Amanda Smothers. You can email me if you ever have any questions afterward. Like I said, I'll probably send the email out tomorrow, my follow-up email. And you can always respond to that as well anytime that you have a question, or you can contact our Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning team too. So have a great week. And if you have any questions, just stick around and I'd be happy to answer those.